Hello everyone, Mr. Nobody here, just bringing you another book review. This is another multi-book review, and I'll try to keep it tight on all three of these. Today I want to talk about The Coddling of the American Mind, The Boy Crisis, and The War on the West. All somewhat random books, all very interesting books, all very books that are close to my own mind and interests, so I'll just leap into them. Okay, first thing, Jonathan Haidt. I love Jonathan Haidt. I owe an enormous debt to Jonathan Haidt because he was the one who sort of pulled me back into academic engagement with the world. After having had some bad experiences myself in the academic world, I sort of lost my taste for it and got out of it, got into a more entrepreneurial world, and I really enjoyed the freedom of that. But then someone who helped pull me back into that was Jonathan Haidt, and it was through this book. And so I owe an enormous debt for this, for getting me re-engaged with it. And so this is just, all three of these books are what I would call understanding the culture of the moment books. And so plenty of people have talked about this book. The title, I also picked it up because I recognized the book as a reference to The Closing of the American Mind, which is a book that I was given by my advisor right at the beginning of college. When I first started college, I was a philosophy student, and I was taking my very first class with one of my favorite professors, and he became my advisor, and he gave me that book, and I found that such an interesting book. It's still such an insightful book. If you actually want to go back in time 20 years and see someone who already understood and foresaw everything that has happened, like, go back and read that book and then just be embarrassed, that someone else had already seen all these things and already talked about them, and already written about them. But then leaping forward, this is another great book that got into it, The Coddling of the American Mind. How good intentions and bad ideas are setting up a generation for failure. And so a lot of that just has to talk about how are we doing things differently, particularly with the current generation. How are we approaching so many subjects, free speech, political correctness, the way we behave online, our expectations for discussions with one another. It's a fantastic book. I think if you don't have time to read this book, Jonathan Haidt also has a lecture that he gave online, which I think he actually gave even at my own school. But it's about what is the purpose of the university. And that is a very good lecture to listen to. I recommend that one. Top recommendations. One of the great things about Jonathan Haidt is such a sweet guy, such a good spirit. I feel like when he wrote some of the things he wrote, he was like, ooh, these might be bad. These might become a problem. And now we are like 10 years on, and he has a slightly different attitude. He's not as patient and speculative anymore. He's more like, it was terrible. It was a disaster. The information is in. Oh my gosh. Social media ended up being a nightmare. We were worried that it wasn't going well. We were speculating that things were going badly for students. We were speculating that they were being taught negative ways of thinking that were actually crippling their emotional stability and intellectual abilities to deal with ideas and discussions. And now he's just like, all right, the data's in, and now he's a little more depressed and he's a little more unhappy about it. And things ended up going far worse, maybe than he had hoped. But sometimes they have to get worse before they can get better. I like this book because it comes at it from the perspective of psychology, including, he does a good job. One thing he does is uniting is ancient wisdom and modern research. And to just tackle the basic content of the book, he says, there are three great untruths that have spread. The untruth of fragility, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. The untruth of emotional reason, always trust your feelings. The untruth of us versus them, life is a battle between good people and evil people. And then he has, he analyzes it through three different lenses. how do each of these untruths contradict ancient wisdom, basically things that all cultures everywhere have known and taught. All the wisest people, and it's been the foundation of their success in society, have taught, yeah, these things are not right. And then it contradicts modern psychological research on well-being, and a lot of that, has to do with um, types of therapy and types of treating people that actually this is the opposite. These are the opposite things you should tell people. These are exactly the things you tell people if you want them to actually have bad outcomes. And then also from the perspective of harm. It harms the individuals and communities and embrace it. What are the practical outcomes? The practical outcomes for believing these things are very destructive. And he just wants to say, they're everywhere now. This is literally the gospel of the modern world. This is what they're teaching you on the university. They're taking your kids and they're teaching them these great untruths that are turning them into these fragile people that and it's not helping them. It's not being kind to them. It's actually harming them enormously, and it goes against all the best psychological research, and it goes against well-established wisdom. So I would say this is one of the top of my lists of, if you're alive today, you should probably read it. Like, if you're alive and in America or the UK or Australia, read this book. It's that simple. If you had to pick one book to read this year, maybe I'd even pick that one. I just enjoy it. I like his writing style too. Not that I agree 100% with everything he says, because of course there's always different perspectives you can offer on the same data. You could come to slightly different conclusions, but he's a wonderful person to listen to. So the next, The Boy Crisis, another book that I would say, if you're alive today, if you're a man, or if you know any men, or if you're a woman or know any women, you should probably read the book. Which it's Warren Farrell is an interesting guy. One thing that I really like about him is if you listen to him talk, he is just overflowing with care and kindness and earnestness. He is such a wonderful, sweet guy that I feel like you just fall in love with, and you can really just sense his desire to help, everyone. And so The Boy Crisis is a book that comes out of that, and a lot of it is just helping you understand boys, but also just males in general. I feel like wives, if they want to understand their husbands, maybe you should read this book. Men, if you want to understand yourself, you should probably read this book. It's helpful about it because there's all these cases. You learn a lot about masculinity in general, a lot about fatherhood. And it's actually is a crisis because a lot of the things he's talking about are very relevant. What are the consequences going to be if all of a sudden the labor participation of young men doubles in the course of like a generation? Like, especially when you're talking about a population that's responsible for young men, an outsized amount of all the crime that happens in America, like, it's going to become relevant to you. You're not going to be able to you will not be able to evade the consequences of the boy crisis because it's half the population is boys, and young men especially. You're either raising them or you're dealing with them. They're just everywhere. It's half the population. You're not going to get away from it. The consequences of it will not be escapable. And so this is a good book too because it's very positive. Why are boys struggling? What we can do about it. I would also say another group that should really read this book is divorced parents. He's had to deal with so many broken homes. He has wonderful amounts of data about if you want good outcomes for your children, what do you need to do? And not just boys. This particular book is focusing on boys, but he also talks a lot about parents and girls and fathers and girls, and that's also something that is in decline. Fatherhood. It's funny, in some ways we're far more involved, and then in other areas of the culture far less. And so wonderful, humongous amounts of data, wide-ranging, wide-ranging, all sorts of problems, and incredibly thoughtful and insightful and very practical too, because he's someone who's actually on the ground working with these people and talking with them and helping them and going through everything from court battles to counseling to support groups. This is someone who's not just writing theory. This is not just theory. This is someone who puts into practice his theories and tests them and has to live and die by them every day, who has to see other people suffer or benefit from his theories. And so much theory really exists in a vacuum, and you never actually have to, you don't personally suffer the practical consequences of your theory being right or wrong. But Warren Farrell is someone who deeply immerses himself in his theory and truly practices it with great passion and with great care. If there's any part of this book that you could skip, the very last part, it's shorter part, it's about ADHD. It's interesting, but, you know, if it's relevant to you, then of course, read it. Less interesting to me. Not as much my area of interest and focus. I'm a little, because I am a parent, a little more focused on the really tangible stuff or on the larger scale, social understanding issues. And but there's so much in there, and so many of his recommendations are very tangible and very helpful, and recommendations that I have passed on to people who are raising children alone, who are divorced, who are in difficult circumstances. This is a very helpful book. This is a book that will greatly, if you're a theoretically interested person, this book will help you understand the world you live in and the people that you're around, young and old. But it is also a very actually practical and helpful book with enormous amounts of tangible things in it. It's also a very hard book for me to read. I'm someone who actually didn't fit in well with male culture and never had a lot to do with it, and I was never very interested in men, and I had more resentment towards them. I was very short, I was very nerdy, I got kicked around a lot, and not just by the boys, even by the girls, because I was really at the bottom of things. But this book helped me understand and appreciate and raised my understanding and value for boys and men and what they contribute, and so it was actually very good for me in that way. It gave me an understanding that I had not had before. So it was also for me a hard book to read. There's a lot of really painful realities about life today that you have to read about in reading this book, and so for some people that might be difficult because it's a messy world out there right now. But Warren Farrell's also given many talks online, many recordings of him talking. He summarizes his points extremely well. If you only have an hour to sit down and listen to him be interviewed by someone, he's talked to so many people, and he does a wonderful job every time. He's a very interesting person talking in person, too. And he looks very much like my advisor in my undergraduate education. So yes, this book is again at the top of my recommendation pile. And so now I'm going to come to this one. This was The War in the West, Douglas Murray. This is a more recent book. He's written other books, The Madness of Crowds. Very articulate, British speaker, conservative. I would say that this is probably his best book, in my opinion. I feel like it's what his other books were trying to be. It's such a gigantic subject. It'd be very easy to get lost in the multiplication of examples. And so he does have to make choices. If you're not someone who has looked deeply into all the stories behind these, he's really just giving you the absolute tip of the iceberg. And every little story that he brings up, if you have the time, it's good to follow up on them and learn more about them, because there's some people and cases where he only has the chance to mention them, but it's fascinating because he's talking about the way that just civilization itself is changing, culture, the internal culture of the West. The war on the West he's talking about is not being waged by some other culture, it's being waged by the West against the West. This isn't about, ooh, well, what is China doing? What is Russia doing? Whatever. In some ways, those are tangential questions. Although he brings them up because it's like, well, if the West can't even hang together internally, what hope does it have in a challenging world, and a world in which it has genuine competitors and even genuine enemies who would actually enjoy seeing it lose its position and seeing the freedoms and prosperity that it's managed to acquire be lost? And so this is a very timely book, very, very speaks to to a lot of the political realities and cultural realities that you're going to actually encounter. If you spend any time on the internet at all, you're just going to run into this stuff. It's become to the point where it's almost inescapable. And what I like about Douglas Murray is that he gives you the complex and reasonable and balanced approach to things. He's a lot of the things he has to say in here, I can see the fingerprints of Thomas Sowell. I've also heard him give the talk version of this book multiple times, different ways to different people, and there's whole sections of it where I'm like, you possibly just took that wholesale, like right out of Thomas Sowell. But it's a very good book. I feel like it's also a book that has a good, it's written in a way that you can give it to someone who is in the middle, someone who is, it's not just for the people like hardcore America, and of course he isn't American at all. But it's not just a book by conservatives for conservatives. It's an insightful and well-written book that he holds himself to good standards of research and discussion and argumentation. He makes his points carefully. He can be a very funny and witty guy, but he doesn't overuse that. And if you just know people who are like, that's kind of some weird stuff going on. That's weird. Oh, I feel like maybe that's a little silly, or maybe that's a little too far. Wait, why are they doing that right now? This is the sort of book that you could give to someone and they could read it and be like, oh, yeah, I do see how all those things fit into a pattern. I do see what's going on. Maybe you're right. I'm going to have to think about this some more. So it is a very good book in that respect. It's an outreach-minded book. I would also say one of the things I appreciate about this book is he actually keeps it pretty tight. It's only 4 chapters with a conclusion. That's keeping it tight, and it's not overly dense, as you can see. It's not written in a incredibly complex and hard to access style of writing. Like I said, he doesn't overload you with information of examples. You can go look them up yourself. There's footnotes, and you can go check things out if you want to know more about it. But he doesn't overload it. He tries to make it accessible. And so I really appreciate that about this book. If you're not familiar with the things Douglas Murray generally talks about, and I had to sum it up, like I said, it's the story of the war on the West by certain intellectual traditions and cultural traditions within it, which you could probably summarize as some sort of postmodernism. He basically points out you're living in the world that Foucault built, and even if you live outside the areas and fields where that's become dominant, it's now spread so much that it's hard to avoid it. It used to be you had to go to certain cities or you had to go into certain fields, especially universities, to encounter these things, but now they're just on the lips of teenagers. They're everywhere. And so you now all of a sudden live in the world that Foucault built, but you may not even know who that is. So I don't know if I would put this on the same class of the last 2 that I talked about. Like I said, the boy crisis, if you're alive and you are an organic being who has to be with men or women, then that's a great book to read. If you have to be in relationships of any kind to any men or women of any age, it's a good one to read. And then same thing, Coddling of the American Mind. That's one of my favorite books on the cultural situation that we're in right now. The War in the West is also very good. I don't know if I'd quite put it on that same level, but it's still good. If you want something to help you look at what the Twitter sphere is twitting about, the sort of phrases and ideas and things you'll just see cropping up here and there and everywhere, and you're like, what is this? Why am I hearing these phrases everywhere? Why has everything become like this? And you want to kind of understand that where is our civilization going? What is it doing? What is the struggle that is taking place over the heart of Western culture? The War in the West is a great book to just enter into that subject. So it's a great entry-level book. And so it gets a very high recommendation for me, even just on that. Very nice entry-level book to the question, and one that really I think should be available to a very wide readership. Now I'm just going to add a very short comment on the end about a fourth book, iGen. Why today's super connected kids are growing up less rebellious, more tolerant, less happy, and completely unprepared for adulthood. Very interesting book if you're interested in generational science. She wrote a book about millennials, and she's a professor of psychology. She writes about generations and just particular culture that they have and how it changes. This was a really interesting book. It's also in many ways a super depressing book. There's, of course, I would say there's a lot of areas of significant disagreement more people could take with her, including things that I would disagree with her. Lots of questions of interpretation, lots of questions of the conclusions drawn. But I would say as an addendum to, if you had to read a book, read this one. But if you were interested in a deeper study, not just of the ideas behind it, but of the people and what it's doing to the people themselves, that would be this book. So I see this book as kind of a complement to this book. This book tells you all about the trends and ideas, and then this book delves into the people and says, what are they like? What are they doing? And you can see the similarity here, how good intentions and bad ideas are setting up a generation for failure, and the generation that they're talking about, super connected, less rebellious, more tolerant, less happy, completely unprepared for adulthood. So that basically tells you the problems that she thinks are in there. She also has a wealth of charts. This is a book with many charts and things. She makes use of enormous amounts of data, which are very interesting and very revealing, and will also, if I had to say any effect of them that it has, is it makes you feel kind of depressed, and it makes you want to never buy your children a cell phone. So if you want anyone to convince you that social media is the devil and that you should never give your children a cell phone, it's these two books together. And right now, Jonathan Haidt's current thing that he's doing, I think the title of the recent speech he's been giving is like, how social media ruined a generation. Like, he used to be more speculative, setting up for failure, and now he's just like, we blew it. We had no idea what the potential catastrophic consequences of these things we invented were. Now we know, and they're terrible. And a lot of that is covered in this book. And so if you want to understand young boys, young girls, teens, college-age people, just post-college, and be like, what are they like? What is their character like? How are they different? How are they different from other generations? What are the factors that seem to be driving that? It's a good book. And like I said, it's a good addendum to the Coddling of the American Mind. So if you have a chance to read it, this is a super readable and interesting book. And I would definitely think about giving it a chance. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. We'll talk to you later.